Welcome to a debate in the race for the 17th Congressional District from the studios of KDKA-TV in downtown Pittsburgh.
Hello and welcome to KDKA's debate between the candidates in Pennsylvania's 17th Congressional District. I'm Ken Rice from KDKA-TV News. It's my honor to serve as moderator for tonight's debate. Let's welcome the candidates, Republican Keith Rothfuss and Democrat Connor Lamb. I'm joined tonight in questioning the candidates by my KDKA-TV News colleagues, Money and Politics editor John Delano and reporter and talk show host Lynn Hayes Freeland. Here are the rules for our debate. The candidates will have 1 minute to answer each question and an additional 30 seconds for a rebuttal. The questioners may jump in at times with a follow-up. We'll make sure the response times given to each of you are equal. And finally, each candidate will have 90 seconds for a closing statement. And so, gentlemen, let's begin. Mr. Rothfuss, the first question goes to you. The nation, as you know, is riveted and deeply split by the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation process, with some believing Dr. Ford, some believing Justice Kavanaugh. There were charges that the Senate and the FBI failed to fully investigate the accusations, failed to investigate whether Justice Kavanaugh may have lied under oath to the Senate. And now the president, just today, has called the misconduct allegations a hoax, quote, all made up, all fabricated. Would you welcome further congressional action to get all the facts, as some are calling for now?
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for hosting the debate. It's great to be here and have this dialogue about the upcoming election. The last few weeks have been riveting. You know, I have 4 daughters, 2 boys, and to see what this country has gone through in this very contentious Supreme Court battle. I think when Susan Collins spoke on the floor this weekend, she pretty much summarized the process of how broken this is. And to try to understand what happened in the process when you had people leaking information that, frankly, Dr. Ford did not want to have out. And so we all sat there gripped watching the testimony of Dr. Ford and then Judge Kavanaugh, and to listen to how Senator Collins articulated her position, and to see how the evidence that was coming forward, the questions that were being asked. Certainly, we do see an effort on the part of the Democrats right now. I think Jerry Nadler, who is the ranking member currently of the Judiciary Committee, is calling for more investigation. Again, this has been a very contorted process. I think the Senate made the right decision.
You are then, therefore, are not calling for any further action by Congress on this matter?
I don't, unless there's other evidence that's out there, and there has been no evidence out there.
Mr. Lamb, do you support some of your fellow House Democrats in calling for additional scrutiny of Brett Kavanaugh, or would you argue that the matter is settled? Time to move on.
Like a lot of Americans, Ken, I didn't like what we saw in the Senate. I don't think that the Senate made us proud. These senators could have at least come together to engage in basic fact-finding and to get a full picture of the facts, and I'm not sure that they did that. They have a lot of opportunity to meet with nominees individually, to have follow-up phone calls, to take a measure of the nominee in person, and neither Keith or I had that opportunity. So from what I've seen, which is the same thing that the public has seen, I haven't seen anything that calls for further investigation. I think the Senate had access to the FBI and a closed report that we'll never see. So to answer your question, no, I don't support these calls that are.
You will differ with your House Democratic colleagues who are saying we will absolutely continue to investigate Kavanaugh if they win a majority.
What I believe is that we have to make decisions based on evidence. I have seen no evidence whatsoever, and I'm aware that the Senate has seen a lot. So yes, I will differ with those in my party who are making those calls right now.
Mr. Rothfuss, rebuttal?
I think we can decry the process that happened in the Senate, but understand what happened the day that Brett Kavanaugh was nominated. You had senators immediately run to the cameras to say that they would oppose him, and they were going to oppose any nominee. And so it's unfortunate to see how this process went the way it did. And as Susan Collins says, it might be time to re-examine this whole process of nominations to the Supreme Court.
Mr. Lamb?
Like I said, I'm not happy with how it played out. I'm not really sure what he's talking about when it comes to redesigning the process, but Keith and I are members of the House of Representatives. We got to see what you saw. It wasn't pretty, and I think it's time for us to talk about the issues at stake in this campaign.
Next question over to John Delano.
Mr. Lamb, let me follow up a little bit on that. You're running in a district that voted for President Trump by 2 points, with lots of Democrats voting for the president. But if you and the Democrats win control of the U.S. House of Representatives, your party is expected to unleash a torrent of investigations against the Trump administration on one matter or another, maybe even impeaching the president. And this could happen regardless of your personal views. So given that, why should any Democrat who supports President Trump vote for you?
Well, I don't expect that, John, and the Democrats that you're talking about don't expect that from me. I've spent a lot of time on the road in the last year talking to people at their doorsteps, in the union halls, anywhere that the voters are, Democrat, Republican, or Independent. And what people have told me time and again is they want us to look forward, not backward. So I'm focused on the issues that are affecting people here, whether it's prescription drug prices or the future of Medicare, student debt for younger people. And again, we make decisions based on evidence. None of us have seen any evidence related to impeachment of anyone. So I would be totally premature, and those in my party who are already calling for that, I think are wrong.
So to be clear, impeachment should not be on the table?
As of this moment, absolutely not, for anyone. Again, I mean, there is an investigation taking place by the special counsel, and I always think it's important to remind people, we have no idea what the special counsel is investigating, and people are quick to talk about the president. We have no idea if the president's even involved in that investigation. We need to let that play out, let Bob Mueller do his job, and then we'll have a decision to make.
Mr. Rothfuss, let me rephrase the question slightly, because some have said that your party, now in control of the House, has essentially shielded the president from any investigation, rarely objecting to his conduct or holding hearings on the many controversies affecting this administration. If you and the Republicans are reelected, is it more of the same? Should we expect the same?
Well, again, we are doing investigations. We have been looking at, for example, what the FBI has been doing. And it's very disconcerting, the whole process by which this investigation started, particularly with the FISA application. This is the so-called Steele dossier that was unverified, according to Director Comey from the FBI. Salacious material. It went to the FISA court, a secret court. And those advocating for the warrant did not give all the information. And you've had inspector generals at the inspector general at the FBI making findings very disturbing about the conduct of officials at the FBI. So we are going to continue to look at that. But it's important to understand, if the Democrats did take the House, I serve on the Financial Services Committee. The ranking member is Maxine Waters. She has been all over this country preaching the message of impeachment. There are other Democrats who are preaching the message of impeachment. If you want to see gridlock set in the United States Congress, that's what you would have. You would have endless investigations. We have the best economy we've had by any measure in 20 years, and we don't want that to be interrupted.
So, again, is it your role, essentially, as a Republican in the U.S. House to protect the president?
Absolutely not. There are three branches of government. There's an executive branch, there's a legislative branch, there's a judicial branch. There should be a healthy tension between the branches, and I have not agreed with everything that this president has done. I'm very concerned, continue to be concerned, for example, with the spending that the president has been proposing. We do have a debt situation that we need to get serious about.
Mr. Lamb.
We have an oversight role to play, but I think we need to play it with respect to things like prescription drugs. I mean, since I've been there, we've never held a hearing as to why we spend taxpayer dollars on drug research and then give that research over to the drug companies and allow them to charge absolutely whatever they want. It's bankrupting people. With respect to gridlock, I mean, respectfully, Keith, gridlock is here, and you've been part of it. That's already happening. So, I wouldn't make the argument that that's going to change based on which party comes into power. The key is that each representative does their job and works for the people of their district.
Mr. Rothfuss.
Yeah, well, gridlock is in the eye of the beholder. The fact is, this has been the most productive Congress in more than 20 years. We have had more legislation signed by the president, passed by both houses, than even the first administration with President Obama, when he had a supermajority in the Senate. Landmark reforms at the VA, landmark legislation dealing with human trafficking, landmark legislation dealing with opioids, delivering on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the regulatory reform, to have the best economy, again, that we've had in 20 years. And looking at last Friday's unemployment rate, lowest since 1969, when Henry Mancini and Sly and the Family Stone were topping the charts.
Thank you, guys.
Lynn Hayes-Freeland, next question.
Mr. Rothfuss, you've closely aligned yourself with President Trump, who seems to have had difficulty with the truth by almost every objective standard. The Washington Post fact-checker claims he has made more than 5,000 false or misleading statements since taking office. But when does this I'm sorry, but when he does this, or even makes disparaging comments about women or people with disabilities, we hear very little from Republican officials. Why is this? And tell us, does the president speak for you?
I speak for myself. In fact, when the president has done things, for example, when the campaign, I put out a statement after the videotape came out. After Charlottesville, I put out a statement saying that the KKK belongs on the ash heap of history. After the meeting in Helsinki, I actually gave a floor speech about how we have to be vigilant about Russia, and I was glad to see finally that Democrats were paying attention to what's been going on in Russia, because you look at the last 10 years, whether it was canceling missile defenses in Poland and the Czech Republic, whether it was President Obama whispering to Medvedev saying, I'll have more flexibility after the election, turning a blind eye with what was going on in Ukraine, the shoot down of the Malaysian airliner, you compare the reactions over the last 10 years and getting tough with Russia, it wasn't happening. You have seen a lot of action going on with getting tough on Russia. We've expelled diplomats, we've closed consulates. So again, I speak for myself. I've been very busy with the legislative work that I've been doing. I don't run to the cameras and criticize everything the president would be saying, because that, frankly, would be a full-time job if I had to try to respond to anything that the president was putting out there.
So then specifically, a week or two ago, when we heard the president make mocking imitations of Dr. Ford, what was your reaction, and what did you say about that?
I think the whole Dr. Ford situation, the whole Judge Kavanaugh situation, was one that really demands utmost sensitivity. This is something that, frankly, has become way too politicized. This whole process has become too politicized. And you can go back 40 years taking a look at how we got here. I remember in 1987 how politicized it became with Judge Bork. So I think it would be better if people did not go out and comment about what was going on inside the Senate.
Mr. Lamb, to be honest, I don't know that I've ever heard you make a comment about these very same comments from the president. Do you believe that he tells the truth, and where do you draw the line?
I think a lot of great journalists have established the fact that the president doesn't always tell the truth, no matter what the subject is. But I think as far as our job goes in the House of Representatives, we have to lead by example. I was at an event on Saturday night where a mother of young children came up to me and she grabbed me by the shirt and said, "What you say matters to my children. People are distressed about their children growing up and seeing this president say false things over the airwaves and the effect that has. But that has to influence how we campaign. I try to keep things positive and tell the truth, to lead by example. And I think in this race you've already seen, 3 or 4 different negative ads from my opponent just in the last 3 weeks that are full of falsehoods and exaggeration, and they're misleading. And I just don't think it's right. I think we have to lead by example.
Mr. Rothfuss, if we're talking about being truthful, being honest, what's your reaction to that?
Everything in my ads are truthful and honest, and it's nice that my opponent would bring that up, because in his very first ad he took a swipe at me and talked about outside money coming in, blasting my name out there as if I would have anything to do with that, and then closing the ad by saying it's time to knock him out. Well, in this season of political rhetoric that we're out there, saying you're going to knock somebody out, I don't think is very helpful.
Mr. Lamb?
I've never used Mr. Rothfuss's name in any of my ads, and they haven't referred to him. So if you want to talk about telling the truth, we can start right there. Outside money is a problem in our campaigns. Everybody knows it, and I think it should stop.
Thank you.
Mr. Lamb, I've got the next question for you. Under President Trump and the Republican-controlled Congress, the national unemployment rate has just fallen to 3.7%, lowest rate since 1969, and it's projected to continue falling. Wage growth is up. Manufacturing activity is up. Consumer confidence is near its highest level in 18 years. Some would say it's a pretty compelling argument for keeping Republicans in power. What do you say?
I think all of the economic news that you just recited is good news, and I'm happy that it's happening. My concern is that they passed a tax bill at the end of last year that added trillions of dollars to our national debt. And it has weakened our ability to do things to promote wage growth, for example. It's something like 1/3 of all jobs in the United States now are at $12 an hour or lower. And everyone knows that after that tax bill, the Republicans are coming for Social Security and Medicare. Paul Ryan has said it. Marco Rubio has said it. They have voted to cut these programs every single year as part of their budget. And the more they add to the debt, the more that they will have to come for money out of those programs. And so I think that's the one reason that Republicans should not stay in power, at least in the House of Representatives.
Mr. Rothfuss, while all those stats that I talked about, they do sound good, a lot of people do feel left out. In a Fox News poll last month, 60% of those polled said they are not seeing extra money in their paychecks despite the Trump tax cuts. 56% feel they feel that things are rigged to favor the wealthy. That's their feeling. Are you going to tell them that they're wrong?
The economy continues to improve. You cited a string of statistics that are very encouraging. None of that would have happened if Mr. Lamb had been in office, because he would not have supported the legislation that we did. Understand, the good economic news we have right now is not an accident. It's not a consequence. It's a result of the policies that we are pursuing. And yes, we need to spread opportunity. I'm very excited about the Opportunity Zones program. I'm looking forward to welcoming Senator Tim Scott to the area to talk about this program that's going to have a direct impact on communities like Aliquippa, Midland, Beaver Falls, McKees Rocks, Stowe, Etna, Penn Hills. This great opportunity to bring in a tremendous amount of private sector capital to really lift that tide. This is something that Jack Kemp had talked about for years, and it's great to see Senator Scott bring this up. But a healthy, growing, dynamic economy is what helps us to address so many things. Mr. Lamb mentioned Social Security and Medicare coming after Medicare. Understand, CBO just looked at what happened because of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and actually with more people coming back to work, we're getting more revenue and it's extending the solvency of the Medicare Trust Fund.
Your time is up. I just want to follow up with you, though. The economy can be healthy, but maybe not healthy for all. And that's what people are telling Fox News that they're feeling. Are the results of the Trump tax cuts, are people genuinely seeing that they're not benefiting everyone, they're helping people at the top?
You know, I was going door to door the other day in Moon Township, and an engineer told me that he got his first raise in 10 years. When I talk to constituents, they're very excited. You look at consumer confidence, you look at every single aspect that's measured in this economy. People do have a sense of optimism.
Why isn't that reflected in the poll? That's really what I'm trying to get to. Why isn't that reflected in polling?
I'm not familiar with the poll you're looking at. Sometimes you can take a look at how the questions are being phrased. The fact of the matter is, we are seeing real wage growth for the first time in years.
Right.
And that's a good message.
Okay. Mr. Lamb, rebuttal?
I think we just differ as to how the economy grows. I think what you've seen on the Republican side is they believe you give up back a lot of money at the very top in terms of tax cuts, and somehow it trickles down. I believe that you just put money where it should go, into the middle. And you do that through individual tax cuts for working people, but you also do it by raising the minimum wage, investing in infrastructure, which creates jobs for iron workers and healthcare workers and electricians. And I think that's what produces real growth.
Mr. Rothfuss, you get the final word on this.
It's interesting to hear Congressman Lamb talk about this distinction of how you generate growth. And I take a look at what some of the other Democrats are saying. For example, Richie Neal, who would be lined up to take over the tax committee, roundly criticizing the tax cut, the very tax cut that Mr. Lamb ended up flipping in voting for. You know, he said previously that he would support a working class or middle class tax cut. Look, we have to extend tax relief for everybody. That is what's generating the kind of economic growth that we're seeing out there. You know, when you're taxing American companies at rates higher than Mexican and Chinese companies, that's not good.
All right, got to move along. Next question goes to John Delano.
Mr. Rothfuss, you opposed the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, consistently from the beginning and voted for its full repeal. But there are protections within the ACA, like preventing insurers from denying insurance or charging higher prices for those with pre-existing medical conditions like cancer, diabetes, and heart disease. Well, last year you voted for a Republican plan that was ultimately killed in the Senate by John McCain. You remember the thumbs down. And this was a plan that would have allowed insurance companies to charge people with pre-existing conditions more for health insurance if states met certain conditions. Do you really think those with pre-existing conditions, like those I listed, should pay more for health insurance? The AARP says on average that could be as much as $27,500 in premiums a year.
Well, they should not, and that's why we structured the bill so that that would not happen. Understand there is a penalty under the Affordable Care Act if you don't maintain continuous insurance. It was called a tax penalty. 80% of the people who are getting hit with that penalty in this state made less than $50,000 a year. Exactly what President Obama said would happen when he was a candidate, talking about why he was against the individual mandate at that time. We expressly provided in the American Health Care Act to protect people with pre-existing conditions. This is personal to me. I'm a cancer survivor. My parents have health conditions. I have every family member has somebody who has a serious health condition. And so, yes, we have to make sure we have mechanisms in place. And under the legislation we proposed and passed in the House, but not the Senate, it had express protection for people with pre-existing conditions, and you were required to maintain continuous coverage. That's what you have to do when you get insured. Otherwise, Obamacare was going to penalize you with a tax penalty, and many advocates for ACA saying, well, these penalties aren't high enough. And we know that ACA didn't work.
It's true that under the Republican plan that the insurance coverage would have to have been maintained for those with pre-existing conditions. But under certain circumstances, it did allow insurance companies to boost up the rates, to raise the costs of premiums for those people.
But only if a state had a plan in place that would help those people. Again, we had a $138 billion state stability fund in that legislation, including $8 billion expressly to help people in the situation that you're talking about.
Mr. Lamb, your response to the same question.
I've been confused by Mr. Rothfuss's position on this all along. There was a law in place, the Affordable Care Act. It protected people with pre-existing conditions. It said for the first time in our history, if you have cancer, diabetes, asthma, heart disease, we will no longer allow insurance companies to discriminate against you. We won't allow them to deny you coverage or to charge you so much that you'll go bankrupt. That was the state of play. And my opponent has voted, I think, 12 times to repeal that law. This isn't about the individual mandate. They found a way to get the individual mandate out of the law without affecting people with pre-existing conditions. And thank God for Senator McCain. Thank God that there was one Republican who had the courage to stand up to his own party and oppose that. And still today, that is the law of the land.
Mr. Rothfuss.
Well, I think if you take a look at the long history of dealing with the issue of pre-existing conditions, the process began in 1996 with the HIPAA legislation. Unfortunately, that was too limited. It only covered people one group plan going to another group plan. What was not included was people in the individual market or people who had never had insurance before. And so you take a look at how the ACA is implemented. You could have accommodated the issue with pre-existing conditions without doing a complete takeover and micromanaging of our health care system, which, according to Chelsea Clinton, the daughter of Mrs. Clinton, said this has resulted in crushing costs. And I'm talking to people all the time who are dealing with these crushing costs under the ACA.
Mr. Lamb, you have the last word on this one.
I still don't understand his position. This is an important provision to protect people. We have to keep it on the books.
Lynn Hayes-Freeland, next question.
My question is for you, Mr. Lamb. The majority of registered African-American voters are Democrats, more than 80%. White voters are more likely to lean toward the Republican Party. The divide between men and women is just as significant. Women are more likely than men to identify with the Democratic Party, as are college-educated voters, while polls show white males, both young and old, leaving the Democratic Party for the Republicans. How does the Democratic Party bridge the racial and gender divides that separate this country?
I think that we've been at our strongest as a party and as a country when we pursue public policies that are universal. Social Security and Medicare are perfect examples. Everybody pays into them, and everybody gets something out of them, no matter who you are. And there are wealthy people all over the country who are proud to take out their Medicare card and show that they're part of the same system as everyone else. It was Frederick Douglass who said, right has no color, truth has no gender, and God is the father of us all. And that's what they teach you in the Marine Corps as well. On one of the first days of boot camp, they tell you, look, there's no color here. There might be light green, there might be dark green, but you're putting on the uniform and we're all green. I think we need to stick with that. That's when we've always been at our best.
Mr. Rothfuss, the Republican Party is now perceived by many to be increasingly a party of one race and one gender. How does the Republican Party bridge the racial and gender divides to become a party that represents all of us?
Well, we do that by reaching out, and as I have done across my district, to meet with people who are doing tremendous work, for example, the Franklin Center in Aliquippa, and to build bridges and to look at programs like the Opportunity Zone program, which I'm very excited about. It's an incumbent upon us to explain how our policies really benefit everybody. We have to find a way to get every single American back in the game again. There are too many people who have been marginalized, too many people who have been pushed to the sidelines. President Bush used to talk about a soft bigotry of low expectations for people. We have to have very high expectations for every single American, because it's when we get every single American back in the game again, which is what we're trying to do with job training, with reforms in the welfare system that can actually coax people back into the labor force without pulling the rug out from under people, and to continue to stress the importance that this country is for everybody. The universal truths in the Declaration of Independence. We have to continue to go back. That's what Lincoln did. Lincoln, the founder of the Republican Party, always went back to the Declaration because that's where our unity should be.
Thank you, gentlemen.
All right, let's talk about safety. Let's talk about protecting our children. Everyone agrees that more can be done, more should be done to help people with mental illness. I'm going to assume that's a given for both of you. So, Mr. Rothfuss, besides addressing mental illness as an issue, what, if anything, are you willing to fight for in Congress to decrease the likelihood of mass shootings?
We have to continue to work on making sure our schools have the resources they need to protect children. Again, I'm a dad with kids in school. This one's personal. And no parent who drops their kid off at school should have to worry about what might happen at school. So, for example, with the Stop School Violence Act that we recently passed, looking to give more resources to local school districts to identify where there might be an issue and to take preventative action. Again, we have to make sure that our background check system is in place. It is. I voted for legislation to fix the background check system for gun purchases. I voted to increase funding for the background check system. We passed significant mental health care reform, which we must continue to make sure the resources are available. You look at the situation in Parkland with this young man who was sending out so many signals. People have a right, the students have a right to be angry about that, because he was broadcasting that he needed help, and people did not respond.
What should school districts do? What specifically do you think local schools should do to keep children safer?
Well, make sure that they have the resources at the school.
I'm sorry, what resources? What specifically?
Whether it's a school resource officer. For some schools who choose to have a metal detector, they should be able to have a metal detector. To have more communication with parents. If there's a student who has a problem, should that student necessarily... I talk to teachers who are frustrated with a student who, they can't control. Right. So we have to take a look at how we're handling students in that sense.
Armed resource officers in schools and armed teachers?
Yeah, that has to be a decision that local school districts would make. I don't think there should be any kind of mandate coming from Washington, D.C. or anywhere. This is a situation that parents need to be involved with, and the local school district.
And very quickly, you said you support closing gaps in the background check system. Would you have background checks done at purchases, gun shows, online, everywhere?
We have a very robust background check system right now.
Right, but would you close those loopholes specifically?
Well, again, is that going to fix any problem? Because you could take a look at every single of these mass shootings we have, and the legislation that my opponent is proposing would have zero impact on that.
So you would not, I'm sorry, I need a very quick answer. You would not be in favor of closing all loopholes?
We have to make sure that we're not going to criminalize the behavior of law-abiding citizens. And if we have a situation out there that needs to be addressed, we'll address it.
Mr. Lamb, you talked about in your special election campaign last spring, you talked about tightening the background checks on gun buyers. What have you done in your admittedly brief time in Congress to address that, if anything? And what else would you fight for, if anything, specifically to prevent mass shootings, keep children safe?
There's a bill authored by my colleague Mike Thompson from California, and it would do two simple things. It would close the loophole for background checks over the internet and at gun shows. Right now, it's too easy for people to get guns in those situations without passing any background check whatsoever. And you can talk to any hunter in Western Pennsylvania, and they think everybody should have to pass the same background check as them. They think people on the terrorist watch list should not be able to buy firearms as easy as they can. That bill has 208 co-sponsors, and it only takes 218 votes to pass a bill in the House of Representatives. Paul Ryan will not bring that bill to the floor for a vote. People are outraged by this. When I tell them that out on the campaign trail, they cannot believe. They ask, what's it going to take? We had Newtown, we had Parkland, and we can't close two simple loopholes in the background check system. I think that's disgraceful, and I think we need to keep working every day to get to that 218 and get that bill passed.
And have you spent any time on that since you've been in office?
I have. I made myself a co-sponsor of that legislation, and I've continued to argue to my colleagues that they should sign on.
What do you say to some Democrats who don't quite get you in that you don't want to look at any new gun laws, you don't want to look at restricting high-capacity clips, anything like that, unless you've changed your position on those issues.
Well, that's a new gun law that I'd like to look at, and I've been in
Which
favor.
one?
The bill that I'm referring to in the House.
Okay, but as far as limiting Americans' access to certain firearms, certain accessories, no change in your position from your last campaign?
That's right.
Okay.
I think part of the reason that we haven't seen new legislation is because we haven't even been able to get the basics right. I think we need a well-functioning background check system that will apply to all firearms and address all examples of shooting.
Thank you. Mr. Rothfuss, rebuttal.
You want to make sure that the legislation we have is actually going to be effective. And I think when Congressman Lamb was debating in the last election, he talked about his work at the U.S. Attorney's Office and how most of the folks he found weren't supposed to have guns anyway. So they were already violating the law. So we have to have laws that make sense, laws that do not infringe on the law-abiding citizens who are out there who may want to freely exchange a gun if your two brothers want to do it or two cousins. But you don't go around playing with an automatic rifle in an ad or a semi-automatic rifle in an ad in this mixture of shootings that we've had.
Mr. Lamb, final 30 seconds.
No one was playing with a rifle in any ad. That's a weapon I was trained to use, and I know how to use it. Keith is right that the background check system is full of holes, and when I was a U.S. attorney, I experienced that myself. People would walk into gun stores and walk out with multiple firearms, and we have not done the work yet to make sure that doesn't happen again.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen. We are going to pause now for a quick break. More of KDKA's 17th District Congressional Candidates Debate right after this.